Have you ever stopped to think about what it really means to see everything from above? I mean truly see, not just look, but witness? There are stories buried in this land that refuse to stay underground, stories that crawl up through the cracks in old foundations and whisper through the wind that passes over abandoned rooftops. Tonight, I want to share with you one of those stories. A story that, honestly, changed something inside me when I first discovered it. And I have a feeling it might do the same for you. This isn't just history. This is a wound that never fully healed, a flame that refused to die even when they tried to drown it in blood and silence. If you're the kind of person who believes that some truths deserve to be heard no matter how uncomfortable they make us, then stay with me. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear, well, let's just say they never wanted this story told. And that's exactly why we need to tell it. What happened on the Whitmore plantation in the summer of 1786 wasn't just rebellion. It was something far more precise, far more devastating. And it all started with a man who learned to read the world from the rooftops. The ruins still stand. If you drive down the old tobacco road outside Charleston, past the new developments and the strip malls, past the gas stations and the fast food chains, there's a turnoff most people miss. A dirt path, overgrown now, that leads to what remains of the Whitmore plantation. The main house collapsed decades ago, but you can still see the skeleton of its ambition. Brick chimneys reaching toward a sky that no longer remembers what happened beneath them. The old tobacco barns have rotted into the earth, their wooden ribs exposed like the carcasses of beached whales. And if you stand in the right spot, just before sunset, when the light turns the color of old honey, you can still see the outlines of where the slave quarters once stood. 37 cabins, 37 tiny prisons of timber and despair, arranged in 3 precise rows like a military formation. The overseers used to joke that the arrangement made it easier to count heads in the morning, easier to notice when someone was missing. What they didn't notice, what they never noticed, was that someone had been watching them from above for 12 years. Someone who had memorized every secret, every hidden grave, every midnight cruelty that the masters thought the darkness had swallowed. The year was 1786, and the man they called Solomon had just finished repairing the roof of the main house for the 43rd time. He stood on the cedar shingles, hammer in hand, and looked down at the world that had tried so hard to break him. And for the first time in 12 years, he smiled. Not a smile of joy, not a smile of hope, a smile of calculation, because Solomon had finally figured out how to burn it all down. The Whitmore plantation sprawled across 800 acres of Carolina low country, a kingdom of tobacco and rice and human suffering that had made 3 generations of Whitmores obscenely wealthy. The main house stood 4 stories tall, an architectural monument to excess that required constant maintenance. The humid Carolina air and the violent summer storms saw to that. The roof alone covered nearly 4,000 square feet, a complex maze of gables and dormers and hidden valleys where rainwater collected and rotted the underlying wood if not properly managed. It was, by any measure, a nightmare to maintain. And that nightmare had been Solomon's responsibility since the day Master Whitmore Sr. discovered that the African he'd purchased for 70 pounds sterling had an almost supernatural understanding of angles and water flow and structural integrity. Solomon had been 17 when they brought him to Whitmore. He'd been born in a village 300 miles inland from the Bight of Benin, the son of a man who built the roofs for the village chief and taught his craft to anyone willing to learn. When the slavers came, Solomon was 20 days into his marriage. His wife was 3 months pregnant with their first child. He never saw either of them again. The journey across the Atlantic took 72 days. Solomon survived by studying the ship itself, the way the planks were fitted, the angle of the masts, the ingenious systems that kept water out and allowed the vessel to breathe. He memorized everything. It was the only thing that kept him sane. When he arrived in Charleston and was sold to Master Whitmore Sr., his value was assessed at the auction block based on his height, 6 feet 2 inches, his weight, 190 pounds, his teeth, all present and healthy, and his apparent docility. He had stopped speaking on day 43 of the voyage and would not speak again for 8 months. What the auctioneer did not assess, what no auctioneer could assess, was the architecture of Solomon's mind. The way he could look at a structure and understand its weaknesses. The way he could calculate angles without instruments. The way he could stand on a roof and know, with absolute certainty, which board would fail first and when. If you want to follow more cases like this, cases that shake society to its core and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any investigation. Master Whitmore Sr. recognized Solomon's gift within the first month. The slave who wouldn't speak could somehow repair roofs that had defeated every craftsman in the county. He could look at a leak and trace it back to its origin point 3 rooms away. He could predict where the next failure would occur before there was any visible sign of damage. By the end of Solomon's first year at Whitmore, the master had stopped calling him by the name assigned at auction, Jupiter, and started calling him Solomon, after the biblical king known for his wisdom. It was in the master's mind a compliment. In Solomon's mind, it was a reminder that even their praise was another form of theft. They had taken his name. They had taken his language. They had taken his wife and his unborn child. And now they were taking his intelligence and calling it their discovery, as if wisdom had not existed in him until a white man noticed it. But Solomon said nothing. He climbed the roofs. He made the repairs. And he watched. The thing about working on rooftops is that no one thinks about you. You're invisible in plain sight. The masters look up and see labor being performed, shingles being placed, nails being driven. But they don't see a person. They don't see eyes. They don't see a mind cataloging every movement on the ground below. Solomon learned more in his first year on Whitmore rooftops than most slaves learned in a lifetime. He learned that Master Whitmore Sr. visited the cabin of a slave woman named Hetty every Thursday night while his wife attended her sewing circle. He learned that the overseer, a thick-necked Irishman named McCullough, had a gambling debt so severe that he'd begun skimming from the plantation accounts. He learned that the master's eldest son, William Jr., had beaten a field hand named Thomas to death the previous spring and buried the body in the northeast corner of the tobacco field. He learned that the master's daughter, Elizabeth, was secretly teaching 3 slave children to read using her old primers, meeting them in the abandoned smokehouse every Sunday while the family attended church. He learned that the plantation cook, an old woman everyone called Mama Tess, had been slowly poisoning the master's hunting dogs for 2 years because one of them had killed her grandson. Solomon learned all of this from the rooftops, and he kept it all inside his head, in a mental ledger that grew more detailed with each passing year. The hierarchy of Whitmore Plantation was precise and cruel, a machine designed to extract maximum labor from human beings while maintaining the illusion of benevolent order. At the top sat Master William Whitmore Sr., a man of 63 who had inherited the plantation from his father and expanded it through a combination of ruthless business acumen and absolute moral blindness. Below him sat his wife, Margaret, a woman whose primary occupation was not noticing the systematic rape that kept the slave population growing at a rate that exceeded natural reproduction. Below them sat their children, William Jr., cruel and stupid in equal measure, Elizabeth, kind but powerless, and Thomas, 11 years old and already practicing his whip technique on the chickens. Below the family came the overseers, McCullough, his assistant Brennan, and the 4 drivers selected from among the slaves themselves, men who had traded their humanity for slightly larger food rations and the privilege of not being whipped. Below the overseers came the house slaves. Those who worked in the main house wore better clothes and were subject to the constant scrutiny of the master's family. And at the bottom, below everyone, came the field slaves, nearly 200 men, women, and children who worked from before sunrise to after sunset, who slept in those 37 cabins, who died at an average age of 34 from exhaustion and disease and despair. Solomon occupied a strange middle space in this hierarchy. He was technically a house slave, but he spent most of his time outside, on the rooftops, alone. He ate with the field slaves but slept in a small room attached to the carpenter's workshop. He answered to McCullough but was often called directly by Master Whitmore himself to assess damage after storms. This middle position gave him access that no other slave possessed. He could move between worlds. He could climb onto the roof of the main house and hear the master's private conversations through the bedroom windows. He could repair the roof of the slave quarters and hear the whispered plans of resistance that the overseers never detected. He was everywhere and nowhere, present and invisible, a ghost with a hammer The routine at Whitmore began at 4:30 in the morning, when the plantation bell rang its first peal, and the field slaves emerged from their cabins into the pre-dawn darkness. By 5, they were in the fields, planting in spring, weeding in summer, harvesting in fall. The work continued until sunset, with 2 brief breaks for food that could barely be called meals. The overseers patrolled on horseback, whips coiled at their sides, watching for any sign of slowed productivity. Solomon's routine was different. He woke at 4 hours before the bell and inspected whatever section of roof he was currently working on before the day's heat made the shingles too hot to handle. He worked in silence, his movements efficient and economical, his eyes constantly scanning the world below. He had divided the plantation into zones in his mind, each with its own patterns and secrets. Zone 1. The main house and its immediate surroundings. Here the family moved according to predictable schedules: breakfast at 7 am, the master in his study by 8 am, the mistress in her sitting room by 9 am, the children with their tutor by 10 am. Zone 2. The overseer's cottage and the workshop area. McCullough was usually drunk by noon, sleeping by 2, awake and vicious by 4. Zone 3. The slave quarters. Activity here was limited during daylight hours, but Solomon had mapped the invisible networks that connected cabin to cabin, who passed messages to whom, who was related to whom, who could be trusted, and who reported to the drivers. Zone 4. The tobacco fields. Solomon rarely had occasion to enter this zone, but from the rooftops he could see everything: the sections where the soil was beginning to fail, the spots where bodies were buried, the paths the slaves used when they snuck away to meet in the woods. And Zone 5. The perimeter. The boundaries of Whitmore Plantation, where the cultivated land gave way to swamp and forest, where escape was theoretically possible but practically suicidal without proper preparation. Solomon had memorized it all. Every building, every path, every weak point, every secret. Leave a comment below. Never give up on the truth if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. The instruments of control at Whitmore were diverse and devastating. The whip, of course, McCullough's favorite, a 9-foot length of braided leather that could strip flesh from bone with a single stroke. The stocks, located in the center of the slave quarters, where offenders were locked for days at a time, exposed to sun and rain and the mockery of those who passed. The iron collar, fitted with bells that announced every movement, reserved for those who had attempted escape. The branding iron, used to mark runaways with the letter R burned into their cheek. The finger crusher, a medieval device that McCullough had purchased from a traveling salesman and used to punish those caught stealing food. The dog pen, where disobedient slaves were confined overnight with the master's hunting hounds. And, worst of all, the threat of sale, separation from family, from children, from everyone you had ever loved, shipped to the brutal sugar plantations of the Caribbean, where life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. These instruments were not hidden. They were displayed prominently, constantly visible reminders of the consequences of resistance. The stock stood in the center of the compound like a monument. The whip hung on McCullough's belt like a badge of office. The branding iron rested in the blacksmith's shop, its R shape always visible, always waiting. Fear was the foundation of the entire system. Fear kept people working when their bodies screamed for rest. Fear kept people silent when they witnessed atrocities. Fear kept people separated, suspicious of each other, unwilling to trust. Solomon had felt that fear. In his first year at Whitmore, he had felt it so strongly that he considered walking into the swamp and letting it consume him. But somewhere in his second year, the fear had transformed into something else. Something harder. Something patient. The fear became fuel. The climate of the Carolina Low Country was itself a form of torture. Summers brought temperatures that exceeded 100 degrees, humidity so thick it was difficult to breathe, mosquitoes that carried fevers that killed dozens of slaves every year. Winters brought cold rains that turned the dirt paths into rivers of mud, pneumonia that filled the slave cabins with the sound of coughing, frostbite that claimed fingers and toes from those without adequate clothing. The transitional seasons, spring and fall, brought storms. Violent, destructive storms that tore roofs from buildings, flooded fields, and created endless work for a man with Solomon's skills. It was the storms that had made Solomon indispensable. The hurricane of 1779 had destroyed every outbuilding on the plantation and damaged the main house so severely that Master Whitmore had considered abandoning it. Solomon had worked for 3 months straight, rebuilding what the wind had torn down, and in the process had earned the closest thing to respect that a slave could receive from a master. "That Negro is worth more than all the others combined," Master Whitmore had told his wife after the repairs were complete. "I'd sooner sell my own son than lose him." Solomon had been standing on the roof, invisible as always, when the master spoke those words. He had memorized them. Not because they flattered him, because they revealed something important about his position. He was valuable, and valuable things were protected, and protected things had access. And access, Solomon had come to understand, was the foundation of power. Solomon's competence extended beyond roofing. Over his 12 years at Whitmore, he had taught himself carpentry, masonry, basic metalwork, and the rudiments of engineering. He could build a chimney that drew properly. He could construct a water wheel that actually worked. He could repair the complex mechanism of the plantation's cotton gin. Each skill he acquired expanded his sphere of movement, his access to information, his usefulness to the master. And each skill he acquired added another tool to the arsenal he was quietly assembling in his mind. The other slaves both revered and feared him. Revered because he used his access to help them when he could, smuggling extra food from the main house, warning of impending inspections, intervening with the overseers when he thought it might be effective. Feared because his closeness to the master made him suspect. Could a man who ate in the main kitchen truly be trusted? Could a man who was never whipped understand the suffering of those who were? Solomon navigated these suspicions with care. He knew that trust could not be demanded, only earned. So he earned it, slowly, over years. A piece of bread slipped to a hungry child. A warning passed to a woman whose husband was being watched. A prayer whispered over a grave that the overseers said should remain unmarked. By his 10th year at Whitmore, Solomon had earned the trust of nearly everyone who mattered. The network he had built was invisible to the masters, but robust among the enslaved. Messages could pass from the farthest field to Solomon's ear within hours. Plans could be discussed across dozens of people, without a single word reaching the overseers. Solomon had become the center of a web that the masters didn't know existed. The paradox of Solomon's position tormented him in the quiet hours. He ate better than the field slaves. He slept in relative comfort. He was never whipped, never branded, never subjected to the worst degradations that the system inflicted on others. And yet he was still a slave, still property, still a name in the master's ledger, valued in pounds sterling, subject to sale at any moment if the master's circumstances changed. This paradox, comfort within captivity, privilege within oppression, created a guilt that Solomon carried like a stone in his chest. Every night before sleep, he would mentally recite the names of those who had it worse. Thomas, beaten to death and buried without ceremony. Hetty, forced to service the master's appetites while her husband worked the fields. Old Jacob, whose wife and children had been sold to pay off a gambling debt. The children born in the cabins, whose first memories were of labor, whose last memories would be of the same. Solomon recited these names like a prayer, like a vow, like a promise that the privileges he received would not make him complicit in the system that granted them. He would use his access. He would use his knowledge. He would use every advantage the masters had mistakenly given him. And when the time was right, he would make them understand that they had been feeding their own destruction. The knowledge Solomon accumulated from the rooftops was comprehensive and damning. He knew that Master Whitmore had filed fraudulent claims with the colonial authorities regarding the size of his land holdings. He knew that McCullough had murdered a slave named William in 1781 and reported him as a runaway. He knew that the master's son had raped at least 7 women in the slave quarters, including a girl of 14, whose subsequent pregnancy had been attributed to a field hand, who was sold the following week. He knew that the plantation's books were falsified, that the master was systematically underreporting his wealth to avoid taxes, that the entire operation was teetering on the edge of financial collapse despite its apparent prosperity. He knew that 3 of the loyal slaves who served as drivers were passing information to a network of free black men in Charleston who were organizing something larger than anyone at Whitmore could imagine. He knew that the master's daughter, Elizabeth, was not merely teaching slaves to read. She was documenting the abuses she witnessed, keeping a diary hidden beneath the floorboards of her room that detailed every atrocity committed on her family's property. Solomon knew all of this because the rooftops made him invisible, because the masters never looked up, because they had built a system so focused on controlling the ground that they forgot about the sky. The year 1783 brought the event that would eventually catalyze everything. It began in October, during the harvest season, when the entire plantation was focused on getting the tobacco dried and shipped before the winter rains. Solomon was repairing a section of the drying barn's roof when he heard shouting from the direction of the slave quarters. He descended quickly and made his way toward the commotion, arriving in time to witness something that would reshape the architecture of his soul. A woman named Abigail, Solomon's sister, not by blood but by shared suffering. A woman who had been on the same ship that brought him from Africa, who had kept him alive during the voyage by singing songs of home in a language the sailors couldn't understand, was being dragged from her cabin by McCullough and two of his men. Her crime, they announced, was theft. She had stolen a piece of fabric from the main house, they claimed. Fabric that was later found in her cabin, placed there, Solomon knew, by one of the drivers who wanted her husband's position. The punishment for theft was 50 lashes. Abigail received 73. McCullough enjoyed his work. When it was over, Abigail couldn't walk, couldn't speak, couldn't see from her left eye, where the whip had caught the edge of her socket. Her husband, Samuel, was forced to watch while two men held him in place. Solomon was forced to watch from the crowd that the overseers had assembled as witnesses. Abigail died 4 days later, from infection, from fever, from the simple fact that her body had decided it had endured enough. Samuel dug her grave himself in the corner of the cemetery where the slaves who died badly were buried. Solomon helped him. They worked in silence because there were no words for what they were feeling. When the grave was filled, Samuel placed a small stone at its head, a stone that Solomon had secretly carved with Abigail's real name. Not the name the masters gave her real name. The one she had whispered to Solomon on the ship. The one that meant, beloved of the morning star, in a language that no one at Whitmore had ever heard spoken. The death of Abigail transformed something fundamental in the plantation's invisible network. Before, the whispered resistance had been about survival, how to endure, how to protect loved ones, how to maintain some fragment of humanity within the dehumanizing system. After Abigail, the whispers changed. They became questions. How long could they endure? How much more could they protect when protection meant witnessing murder and calling it justice? How could they remain human while the system treated them as animals? Samuel, broken by grief, approached Solomon one night in the carpenter's workshop. His eyes were empty, his hands were shaking. "I'm going to kill him," he said. Not McCullough, him, Master Whitmore himself. "I'm going to walk into that house and I'm going to put my hands around his throat and I'm going to squeeze until his eyes pop out of his head." Solomon listened. He didn't argue. He didn't counsel patience or caution or the wisdom of waiting. He simply asked one question. And then what? Samuel didn't have an answer. He hadn't thought beyond the moment of revenge. He didn't know that the house had 3 armed men in it at night. He didn't know that the doors were locked from inside after nining. He didn't know that McCullough slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow and 2 more hanging from his bedpost. He didn't know any of the things that Solomon knew. "Let me help you," Solomon said. "Let me help you do this right. Not just revenge, liberation. Not just one death. All of them." Samuel stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, and the planning began. The escalation of atrocities over the following months seemed almost designed to strengthen Solomon's resolve. In November, a field hand named Jerome was caught with a forged travel pass and was burned alive in front of the assembled plantation as a warning against attempted escape. In December, 3 women were raped by William Jr. during a drunken celebration of the New Year, and when one of them, a girl of 16 named Clara, was found to be pregnant, she was sold to a trader headed for the Caribbean, rather than face the scandal of bearing the master's grandson. In January, an elderly man named Marcus collapsed in the fields from exhaustion. When he couldn't rise quickly enough, McCullough had him trampled by horses. In February, the master's wife decided that the children of the slave quarters were becoming too numerous and ordered the sale of all children under 5 years of age. 12 children were taken from their mothers in a single day. The screaming lasted until nightfall. Solomon witnessed all of it, from the rooftops, from the shadows, from the middle space he occupied between the world of the masters and the world of the enslaved. Each atrocity was catalogued, each face was remembered. Each name was added to the ledger in his mind, and each addition strengthened something inside him that was beginning to feel less like rage and more like certainty. The trauma that pushed Solomon past his final point of hesitation came in April of 1785, his own blood, his own family. The masters didn't know that Solomon had fathered children at Whitmore. He had been careful, so careful to keep that information hidden. His wife was a woman named Josephine, who worked in the main house kitchen. They had never been allowed to marry officially, of course. Slave marriages had no legal standing. But they had made their own vows in secret, witnessed by Mama Tess, and sealed with a prayer in Solomon's native tongue. Their daughter, Mary, was 7 years old. Their son, Daniel, was 4. Solomon saw them rarely. Too frequent contact would draw attention, create leverage that the masters could use against him. But he watched them from the rooftops, watched Mary carry water to the house, watched Daniel play in the dust outside the kitchen door, watched Josephine move through her days with a grace that made his heart ache with love and terror. In April, Master Whitmore decided to make William Jr. a wedding gift. The gift was to be 12 slaves, selected from the Whitmore stock, to staff the household of William Jr.'s new wife on her family's property in Georgia. Among the 12 selected was Josephine, and Mary, and Daniel. Solomon learned of this from the rooftop of the main house, where he was repairing a leak in the master bedroom ceiling. He heard Master Whitmore tell his wife, heard the casual way they discussed the separation of families like the redistribution of furniture. He heard the master say, "The cook will adjust, they always do." He heard the mistress say, "The children will be good playmates for our grandchildren." He heard them laugh. Solomon did not climb down from the roof for 3 hours. When he finally descended, his face was composed, his movements controlled. But something inside him had broken and reformed into something harder, something sharper, something that no longer asked whether revenge was justified but only how it could be accomplished. The ritual of Solomon's private grief occurred that night, in the woods beyond the plantation's edge. He walked for 2 miles through swamp and forest, following a path he had memorized years ago, until he reached a clearing where a massive oak tree stood alone. This was his sacred space, the place where he came to remember who he had been before, the place where he spoke to ancestors in a language that no one at Whitmore understood. He knelt at the base of the oak and pressed his forehead to its bark. He stayed that way until the moon rose. Then he spoke, not to God, not exactly, but to something older and more familiar. He spoke in his birth language, the words rough in his throat from disuse but still present, still alive. He asked for strength. He asked for wisdom. He asked for the courage to do what needed to be done and the clarity to do it well. And he made a vow, not to the tree, not to the ancestors, to Abigail, whose real name meant beloved of the morning star, to Josephine, who would be taken from him, to Mary and Daniel, who would grow up in a stranger's house, who might never know that their father had loved them with a ferocity that the masters could not comprehend. He vowed that Whitmore would burn, not in the chaos of a failed uprising, not in the futility of a single man's rage, but in the precise, calculated destruction that only someone who knew every secret could orchestrate. He vowed that the masters would know before they died that they had been destroyed by the very man they thought they owned. And he vowed that those who survived, and some would survive, that was part of the plan, would carry the story, would spread it, would make Whitmore a name that planters whispered in fear for generations. The antagonist landscape of Whitmore was more complex than a single villain. Master Whitmore Sr. was cruel, yes, but his cruelty was bureaucratic. He saw slaves as assets, not people, and his violence was the violence of a man balancing ledgers. His son, William Jr., was something worse, a sadist who enjoyed the suffering of others, who sought out opportunities to inflict pain, who had learned that his position gave him impunity and used it to gratify his darkest impulses. McCullough was a different kind of monster, a man who had failed at everything in his life and found, in the absolute power granted to overseers, a compensation for his inadequacy. The drivers, men like Ezekiel and Jonas and Peter, were the most complicated of all. Slaves who had chosen survival over solidarity, who enforced the master's rules with a zeal born of self-preservation, who were hated by their fellow slaves and trusted by no one. Beyond these individual antagonists was the system itself. The laws that defined black people as property, the courts that refused to hear their testimony, the churches that blessed the institution, the economy that depended on their labor, the entire apparatus of civilization that had been constructed to make their enslavement seem natural and inevitable. Solomon understood that his enemy was not merely a collection of men. His enemy was a world. The catalyst that finally set the plan in motion came in May of 1785, 3 weeks before Josephine and the children were scheduled to leave for Georgia. A traveling minister arrived at Whitmore to perform the wedding ceremony for William Jr., and with him came news from other plantations. News of resistance. In Jamaica, a group of slaves had taken control of a plantation for 3 days before the militia arrived. In Saint-Domingue, there were whispers of something larger brewing, of networks forming, of a day coming when the enslaved would rise together. And in Virginia, a man named Gabriel, a blacksmith, like Solomon a craftsman with access and intelligence, was said to be organizing something unprecedented. The minister discussed these events at dinner, which Solomon heard from his position on the roof, where he was pretending to repair a chimney. The master and his family discussed them with a mixture of fear and contempt. "Savages," Master Whitmore said. "They don't understand that we're protecting them from themselves." "They need firmer control," William Jr. said. "Father has been too lenient." "Perhaps," the master mused, "we should consider selling some of the more intelligent ones. They're the ones who cause trouble." Solomon heard this. He heard the master's casual discussion of selling intelligent slaves. He heard William Jr.'s suggestion of firmer control. And he heard the note of fear beneath their contempt, the recognition, barely acknowledged, that the system they had built was more fragile than they wanted to admit. That night, Solomon gathered the inner circle of his network. Samuel, Mama Tess, a field hand named Joseph who had been a soldier in Africa before his capture, a young woman named Rebecca who worked in the main house and had access to the keys, and Elizabeth, yes, Elizabeth Whitmore, the master's daughter, who had been secretly documenting atrocities for years and who had finally decided that documentation was not enough. "It happens on the wedding day," Solomon said, "while they're celebrating." The public humiliation that served as Solomon's final psychological fuel came the following week. The master, perhaps influenced by his son's suggestion of firmer control, decided to make an example. The victim was a man named Benjamin, one of Solomon's closest allies in the network, a quiet man who had never caused trouble, whose only crime was that he had been seen speaking with Solomon too frequently. The charge was insubordination, a vague offense that could mean anything. The punishment was public branding. They did it in the center of the slave quarters, at noon, with everyone forced to watch. McCullough heated the iron himself, taking his time, letting the anticipation build. Benjamin was stripped and held by 4 men. The R for runaway was pressed into his cheek even though he had never attempted escape. A permanent mark of shame for a crime he hadn't committed. Solomon stood in the crowd, his face betraying nothing. But when Benjamin's eyes found his across the assembled slaves, a message passed between them. A promise. A confirmation. Benjamin's scream when the iron touched his flesh was the last hesitation burning out of Solomon's soul. The selection of conspirators had been going on for years, though most of them didn't know they were being selected. Solomon had been watching, evaluating, testing. Every time he helped someone, he watched how they responded. Did they hoard the help or share it? Did they speak of it to others or keep it secret? When he passed information, did they use it wisely or recklessly? Over 12 years, he had identified the ones who could be trusted, the ones who could be relied upon, the ones who would hold their nerve when the moment came. The inner circle numbered 12, a number Solomon chose deliberately. 12 disciples, 12 months, 12 children sold in February. But beyond the inner circle was a larger network of over 60 people who would play supporting roles. Some would create distractions, some would secure weapons, some would prepare the escape routes, and some, the most important, would do nothing at all except maintain absolute normalcy, giving no sign that anything unusual was about to occur. The genius of Solomon's plan was its distribution. No single person knew everything. No single failure could compromise the whole. If one conspirator was captured and tortured, they could only reveal their own small piece of the puzzle. The full picture existed only in Solomon's mind, and he had no intention of being captured. The division of functions was precise. Joseph, the former soldier, would lead the direct action, the seizure of weapons, the neutralization of the overseers, the physical control of key locations. Samuel would coordinate the field hands, ensuring that when the signal came, 200 people would move in organized concert rather than chaotic panic. Rebecca would secure access to the main house, using her position and her keys to ensure that the family could not barricade themselves inside. Mama Tess would prepare the final feast, the wedding dinner that would be the last meal certain people ever ate. Elizabeth would ensure that the documentation of atrocities was complete and would be distributed to newspapers in Charleston if the uprising succeeded. And Solomon himself would handle the most delicate task, the selective destruction of evidence that would allow some to survive while others faced justice. Because Solomon's plan was not merely destruction, it was theater. A performance designed to send a message that would echo across every plantation in the South. The message was simple. You are not safe. Your roofs will not protect you. Your locks will not keep us out. We see everything, and we remember. The resources available to Solomon's network were surprisingly substantial. Over the years, he had accumulated tools, hidden in the carpenter's workshop, buried in the woods, concealed in places only he knew. He had stockpiled lamp oil, acquired from the main house in quantities too small to be noticed but sufficient, over time, to fuel a conflagration. He had mapped every firearm on the plantation, the master's pistols, McCullough's rifles, the old muskets stored in the barn from the Revolutionary War. He had calculated the angles of attack, the time it would take for help to arrive from neighboring plantations, the routes by which the slaves could escape into the swamp and make their way to the network of free black communities that existed, secretly, throughout the Low Country. Most importantly, he had information, secrets that could be leveraged, scandals that could be threatened, knowledge that gave him power even before the first blow was struck. McCullough's gambling debts were held by a Charleston merchant who would be very interested to learn that his money had been embezzled from a Whitmore account. The master's fraudulent land claims could be exposed to authorities who were looking for reasons to investigate wealthy planters who didn't pay their taxes. William Jr.'s crimes could be documented in ways that even a slave-holding court could not ignore. The date chosen for the uprising was June 18, 1785, the day of William Jr.'s wedding. Solomon had selected this date for multiple reasons. First, the wedding would bring visitors to Whitmore, increasing the number of witnesses who could spread the story afterward. Second, the celebration would require the preparation and serving of food and wine, providing opportunities for Mama Tess's contributions to take effect. Third, the festivities would distract the overseers, who would be drinking and celebrating rather than patrolling. Fourth, the date fell 2 weeks before Josephine and the children were scheduled to leave for Georgia. And fifth, most importantly, June 18th was the anniversary of Solomon's arrival at Whitmore. 12 years to the day. A circle completing itself. The method Solomon developed had no official name, but in the weeks and months that followed, it would come to be known simply as the roof. The name captured something essential about the approach. The use of architectural knowledge to transform the master's own house into a trap. Solomon had spent 12 years learning every weakness in Whitmore's structures. He knew where the chimneys connected to the wooden beams. He knew where the roof joists were weakest. He knew which walls would fall first in a fire, and which would stand longest. He knew the escape routes the masters would instinctively seek, and exactly how to block them. He knew how to make a building burn slowly enough to trap its occupants, but quickly enough to prevent effective response. He knew all of this because he had been maintaining these structures for 12 years, repairing their weaknesses, extending their lives, learning their secrets. And now he would use that knowledge to end them. The countdown to June 18th proceeded with agonizing slowness. Each day Solomon went about his normal routines. He repaired roofs, he answered the master's summons, he ate in the main kitchen and slept in the carpenter's workshop. He gave no sign that anything was different, but beneath the surface, final preparations were being made. Weapons were moved to their staging points, escape routes were confirmed. Messages were passed through the network, each person receiving their instructions for the day of the wedding. And in the basement of the main house, concealed among the wedding supplies, Mama Tess was preparing a special vintage. The night before the wedding, Solomon climbed to the roof of the main house one final time, not to repair anything, to remember. He stood on the cedar shingles and looked down at the world that had tried to break him. He saw the slave quarters where 200 people were sleeping, some dreaming of freedom and others dreaming of the dead. He saw the overseer's cottage, where McCullough was drinking himself into unconsciousness. He saw the tobacco fields, silver in the moonlight, where so much suffering had occurred. And he saw the main house itself, glowing with candlelight as the family prepared for tomorrow's celebration. They had no idea what was coming. They had spent 12 years feeding Solomon, housing Solomon, protecting Solomon's value as an asset. And tomorrow, that asset would demonstrate its true worth. Solomon stayed on the roof until the moon set. Then he descended, for the last time, and went to find his wife. The morning of June 18th dawned clear and hot, a perfect Carolina summer day. The plantation was alive with activity by 6 Aguars, house slaves preparing the feast, field hands decorating the grounds, carriages arriving from neighboring estates bearing guests in their finest clothes. Solomon watched it all from the carpenter's workshop, where he was ostensibly preparing chairs for the outdoor ceremony. In reality, he was confirming signals with his network, making final adjustments to the plan. Rebecca reported that the family was occupied with their preparations. Joseph reported that the weapons had been moved to their final positions. Mama Tess reported that the wine was ready, and Elizabeth reported that she had hidden copies of her documentation in 3 separate locations, each with instructions for delivery if she didn't survive the day. Everything was in place. Now they waited. The wedding ceremony took place at 4 in the afternoon, in the garden behind the main house. The minister presided. The guests applauded. William Jr. and his new bride exchanged their vows, while the slaves who had raised them, dressed them, cooked for them, and been beaten by them stood in silent attendance at the edges of the crowd. Solomon watched from a distance, hammer in hand, pretending to work on a fence post that needed no repair. He saw the master beaming with pride. He saw the mistress dabbing tears from her eyes. He saw McCullough and the other overseers drinking champagne stolen from the master's cellar. And he saw, in the faces of the enslaved, the terrible patience of those who know that justice is coming. The ceremony ended at 5 Hall. The guests moved to the dining room for the feast. The sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. And Solomon gave the signal, a specific arrangement of his tools on the carpenter's bench, visible to anyone who knew to look, that the operation had begun. The first phase was the wine. The guests settled into their seats around the long dining table, 23 of them in total, including the Whitmore family, the bride's family, and various wealthy neighbors. The first course was served. The wine was poured. Toasts were raised. And within the hour, the first symptoms began to appear. Mama Tess had been careful. The poison she'd prepared wouldn't kill quickly. It would incapacitate. Severe stomach cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, confusion. Within 2 hours, every guest at that table would be too sick to stand, let alone fight or flee. The second phase was the isolation. While the guests were becoming ill, Joseph's team moved with precision. The overseer's cottage was surrounded. McCullough, already drunk, was taken before he could reach his weapons. His assistant Brennan was found unconscious in the barn, having sampled some of the wedding wine. The drivers were contained in their quarters, held by field hands who had been waiting years for this moment. One by one, Every person capable of mounting resistance was neutralized, not killed, not yet, but rendered helpless. The third phase was the main house. Rebecca unlocked the doors. Solomon entered first, followed by 12 of his most trusted allies. The scene in the dining room was chaos. Guests collapsed over their plates, groaning in agony, too sick to understand what was happening. Master Whitmore was on his knees, vomiting into a silver bowl. His wife was unconscious in her chair. William Jr. was crawling toward the door, his wedding suit stained with his own waste. And the bride, the innocent bride, who had committed no crime except being born into a criminal system, was crying in the corner, calling for her mother. Solomon stopped in front of Master Whitmore. The man looked up, his face pale, his eyes struggling to focus. "Solomon," he whispered. What is happening?" Solomon knelt so that their faces were level. "I am not Solomon," he said. "My name is Adaiz. It means king's daughter, in a language you never bothered to learn. And this is your judgment." The executions that followed were precise, symbolic, and documented. Each member of the Whitmore family was tried before a tribunal of the enslaved, with Elizabeth reading the charges from her diary. Master Whitmore, 37 counts of murder by deliberate overwork, 15 counts of rape, 200 counts of unlawful imprisonment. Mistress Whitmore, complicity in all charges plus the specific crime of ordering the sale of 12 children in February. William Jr., 7 counts of rape, 3 counts of murder, and the specific crime of having Thomas beaten to death and buried without ceremony. The sentences were death. But the method of execution was different for each. Master Whitmore was given to Samuel, Abigail's husband, who strangled him slowly with the same type of rope that had bound Abigail during her whipping. Mistress Whitmore was given to the mothers whose children had been sold, who did not share with Solomon what they did to her in that room. And William Jr., the sadist, the rapist, the man who had tortured for pleasure, was given to his victims. All 7 of them. Solomon did not watch. The sounds were enough. The fire began at midnight, after the executions were complete, and the survivors, the guests, the bride, young Thomas Whitmore, who was only 11 and had not yet committed crimes sufficient for death, had been moved to safety outside the compound. Solomon had prepared the main house carefully, oil in the walls, kindling in the attic. Every escape route blocked except one, and that one led directly to where his people were waiting. The fire started in 3 places simultaneously: the main house, the overseer's cottage, and the tobacco barns. Within minutes, flames were visible for miles. Within hours, the entire plantation was an inferno. Solomon stood and watched, holding Josephine's hand on one side and his children's hands on the other. He watched 12 years of suffering turn to smoke and ash. He watched the system that had enslaved him consume itself. And when the sun rose over the ruins of Whitmore Plantation, he led his people into the swamp, toward the network that would carry them north. The exodus from Whitmore numbered 217 souls: men, women, children, the elderly, the sick, the broken, the defiant. All of them walking in a column through the Carolina swamp, guided by paths that Solomon had mapped from the rooftops years ago. They walked for 3 days, resting during daylight hours and moving by night, eating food they'd stockpiled and drinking from streams Solomon had identified as clean. On the morning of the 4th day, they reached the first station of the network, a small farm owned by a free black man named Henderson, who had been waiting for them. From there, the column dispersed. Some went north, toward Philadelphia and freedom. Some went south, toward the free black communities in Florida. Some stayed in the network, becoming guides themselves, helping future escapees follow the paths that Solomon had pioneered. And some, including Solomon himself, and Josephine, and Mary, and Daniel, disappeared into history, their final destinations unknown. The official reports of what happened at Whitmore reached Charleston within days. The colonial authorities dispatched investigators who found little but ash and corpses. 17 white people dead, including the entire Whitmore family except for young Thomas, who survived with burns and nightmares that would haunt him for life. Over 200 slaves missing, presumably fled. Property damage estimated at £15,000 sterling. The investigators' report used words like massacre and savagery and the natural consequences of insufficient discipline. It did not mention the diary that Elizabeth had hidden, which would surface years later in an abolitionist newspaper. It did not mention the network that had facilitated the escape. And it did not mention the name that the escaped slaves gave to their method, the roof. Word of Whitmore spread through the plantation system like fire through dry grass. Within weeks, every enslaver in the Carolinas knew the basic story. Within months, versions of it had reached Virginia, Georgia, Louisiana, and the Caribbean. The details varied in the telling. Some versions made Solomon into a giant, some made him a devil, some made him a prophet. But the core message remained consistent. A man had learned their secrets from above. A man had used their own structures against them. A man had demonstrated that the system they believed was unshakable could be brought down by someone patient enough to learn its weaknesses. The name The Roof became a code among the enslaved, a whispered promise of possibility. And it became a nightmare among the enslavers, a fear that every craftsman, every house slave, every person given access might be another Solomon, watching, waiting, planning. The response of the colonial authorities was swift and brutal. New regulations were passed restricting the movement of skilled slaves. Craftsmen were required to work under closer supervision. Access to rooftops was limited. Overseers were instructed to watch for unnatural interest in structural matters. But the genie could not be returned to the bottle. In the years that followed Whitmore, there were 17 documented cases of roof uprisings, coordinated attacks on plantations that used architectural knowledge and insider information. Some succeeded, most failed, but all of them carried the same message that Solomon had sent. You are not safe. We are watching. We remember. The hunt for Solomon became an obsession for certain elements of the colonial establishment. A bounty of 500 pounds was placed on his head, the largest bounty ever offered for an escaped slave in the Carolinas. Hunting parties scoured the swamps. Informants were cultivated. Free black communities were raided on suspicion of harboring him. But Solomon was never found. The network had hidden him too well. Or perhaps, as some whispered in the slave quarters of surviving plantations, he had never been merely a man. Perhaps he had been something older, something that the chains could not hold, something that had returned to the sky where it belonged. The final stand of the Whitmore conspirators came not from Solomon himself, but from those members of the network who chose to stay and fight rather than flee. Joseph, the former soldier, led a guerrilla campaign from the swamps for 3 years, attacking supply wagons and freeing slaves from other plantations. He was eventually cornered by a militia force near Georgetown in 1788. He killed 7 men before he fell, and his last words, recorded by a witness, were, "Tell Solomon, we held the roof." Rebecca was captured in 1787, trying to help another group of escapees reach the network. She was executed publicly in Charleston, but she gave up no names and revealed no secrets. Her last words were, "I regret nothing." Mama Tess was never captured. She simply disappeared on the night of the fire and was never seen again. Some said she had fled north with Solomon. Others said she had walked into the swamp and let it take her, preferring death to recapture. And still others said, and this was the story that endured longest, that she had never been merely human at all. That she was a spirit of vengeance summoned by the suffering of the enslaved, who had completed her task and returned to wherever such spirits dwell. The legend of Solomon grew with each passing year. Among the enslaved, he became a figure of hope, proof that resistance was possible, that the masters were not invincible, that patient intelligence could overcome brute force. Stories circulated about his supernatural abilities. Some said he could become invisible. Some said he could walk through walls. Some said he could read the future in the patterns of roof shingles. None of these stories were true, of course. Solomon was a man, a craftsman, a husband, a father, a prisoner who refused to let his imprisonment define the limits of his mind. But the stories served a purpose. They kept the possibility of freedom alive. They reminded those who heard them that the system that oppressed them was built by human hands and could be dismantled by human hands. They transformed Solomon from a person into a symbol, and symbols, unlike people, cannot be killed. Among the enslavers, the legend of Solomon took a different form. He became a boogeyman, a warning, a reason for ever-tightening control. Whenever a slave seemed too intelligent, someone would invoke Solomon's name. Whenever a craftsman asked too many questions, suspicion would fall. The fear of another Solomon shaped plantation policy for a generation, leading to restrictions that, ironically, reduced the efficiency of the system and hastened its eventual collapse. The masters never understood that their fear was itself a form of defeat, that every time they invoked Solomon's name, they were acknowledging that a slave had beaten them, that a man they had owned and used and believed they controlled had demonstrated capacities they could not comprehend. Solomon's victory was not merely the fire that consumed Whitmore. It was the fear that consumed the master's peace of mind for decades afterward. The artifacts that remained from Whitmore became objects of pilgrimage for the enslaved and objects of dread for the enslavers. The stone that marked Abigail's grave was removed by authorities, but reappeared mysteriously in different locations, always carved with her true name. The diary that Elizabeth had compiled was published in Philadelphia in 1790, causing a scandal that reached the halls of Congress. The ruins of the main house became a place where escaped slaves were said to gather, drawing strength from the ground where Solomon had demonstrated what was possible. And the rooftops of the Carolina Low Country became, for those who knew the code, messages of resistance, a specific arrangement of shingles, a particular angle of repair. Signs that Solomon's network had once existed and might exist still. The scholarly debate about Solomon began almost immediately and continues to this day. Historians argue about the details: how many died at Whitmore, how many escaped, whether Solomon ever actually existed, or was a composite figure created by enslaved communities to embody their hopes. Some scholars dismiss the entire story as legend, noting that documentary evidence is fragmentary and contradictory. Others point to the diary, the official reports, the subsequent restrictions on skilled slaves as evidence that something significant occurred, and still others argue that the historical accuracy of Solomon's story matters less than its impact, that whether or not he existed exactly as the legends describe, he existed as a possibility, as proof that the seemingly permanent could be destroyed, as a reminder that those who appear powerless may simply be waiting. If you watch this far, it's because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who you are and who really cares about the search for historical truth. The popular memory of Solomon differs from the scholarly debates. In the communities descended from those who escaped Whitmore, Solomon is neither legend nor historical figure, but ancestor, a member of the family who did what needed to be done and paid the price that needed to be paid. Songs are sung about him at gatherings. Children are named after him. The details of his life are passed down not as abstract history but as personal inheritance. And the lesson of his story is transmitted not as academic argument but as practical wisdom. Learn everything you can. Watch everything you see. Trust only those who have earned it. And when the time comes, if the time comes, be ready to act. The final image of Solomon that endures in collective memory is not the fire, not the escape, not the hunt that followed. It is an image from before. From the years of patient watching, the years of accumulated knowledge, the years of invisible preparation. The image is this: a man on a rooftop, hammer in hand, looking down at a world that believes it owns him. His face reveals nothing. His movements are precise and economical. He is doing his work, maintaining the structure that imprisons him, extending its life with every nail he drives. And he is smiling. Not a smile of joy, not a smile of hope. A smile of certainty, because he knows something that the masters below will never understand. He knows that the very structure he is maintaining contains the seeds of its own destruction. He knows that the skills they force him to learn are the skills he will use to tear down their world. He knows that the access they give him, believing it makes him valuable, makes him something far more dangerous. He knows all of this because he has seen it from above, from the rooftop, from the place where no one thinks to look for a man with a hammer and a plan. Like this video, if Solomon's story touched your heart, share it so that his memory may never be forgotten.